So thank you for coming, and sort of apologies too. I think I'm not somebody who knows a lot about market design, and I didn't have a paper on market design, but Ben said, we're having this conference, it looks interesting, and part of the goal is apparently to get people who are not working on this topic to start working on this topic. So I'm going to talk about something I have been working on quite a bit, is thinking about how information markets in developing countries work and evolve. The bulk of what I talk about will be work I've done, but I'll talk a fair amount about some other work done by Michael Kramer and others. And then I also need to disclose that a lot of this work is being done by a nonprofit organization called Precision Agriculture for Development, which Michael and I set up with others to design, evaluate, and scale mobile phone-based agricultural advice around the world. So I'm super happy to get as much feedback as you can, and I apologize for missing yesterday. I'll manage to be here today, and I'm grateful to looking forward to hearing all the other talks. But please interrupt with questions, comments, thoughts at any point. I'm probably not going to go my full time. So basically, what I'd like to talk about just is frictions in information markets, and think about how we can use this platform we're building to help better understand them and help better think about market design. And I should also apologize to my discussant, because he got sort of two somewhat related papers, but no really coherent thesis statement with 5 arguments. So he gets a lot of free rein to talk about what he wants, and I will be grateful for anything he has to say. So the motivation of my work, or our work in the past 5 years, has basically been like the tremendous promise of information services in emerging markets, right? So the social cost of communicating by mobile phone is basically approaching zero. Rural cell phone towers are not congested. You can send at least 3G data there now. They'll do some great upgrades to 4G and 5G over time, and that will be profitable. But it's basically heading down to zero. And then we have a ton of settings in development where information has been shown to improve outcomes, such as educational choice, agricultural decisions, medicine, et cetera. So that's sort of the basic premise. And then I guess the ICT revolution, or the data analytics revolution, holds forth even greater promise, which is to provide customized advice to individuals, which may be even more valuable. So I'm not going to talk about it today, but we're doing a trial in Gujarat where we're giving farmers, we're saying, Dilip, your soil was tested 2 months ago, and it was found to be lacking in this nutrient, and so we recommend the following course of fertilizer for you, and we give him the exact number of kilograms he needs to apply and when he needs to apply it, and then we sort of lead him through the growing season and give that sort of custom information. So there's like tremendous potential, I think, for information services to improve decision making and outcomes, but I think there are a lot of real challenges as well. And number one, I think this has been on my mind for at least 10 years, is just the markets for information don't seem to function very well. If you look at markets for financial advice in the United States or in emerging markets, on many dimensions you'd characterize them as pretty terrible, with people giving pretty biased advice and people not trusting the advice they're getting. And then you might say, okay, maybe this is something that the government should just provide, like we have the FDA or other organizations. But I think there's also evidence that the government's pretty terrible at execution as well. And if people are curious, I can show you some evidence from India. So it seems like it's a conundrum with tremendous opportunity, but actual real chance that it's not going to work out really well. And then I think it's a pretty complicated problem, right? So we've got heterogeneous preferences or circumstances, which mean that advice may not be necessarily one size fits all, and so that makes the market, that makes the ability of reputation and information sharing about the quality of service providers perhaps less valuable. And I think we're really on the cusp of this sort of arrival of AI chatbots and agents who will do stuff for you. And you see, and I apologize if there have been 15 papers and conferences on market design written on these topics already, but to me it's a really interesting topic that doesn't have much literature, right? In the US now, you can get a chatbot that will monitor your auto rental reservations and try to get you better deals when the price goes down, but we also have a bunch of other things. So how do you market these products? How does the customer evaluate them? How do you think about matching? I think there are a lot of really interesting problems here to which I unfortunately don't have a solution. But the standard is you go onto eBay and you can say, I'm looking for a killer handbag under $80, and it says, what type of bag would you like? And you click this button or that button, and then it says, okay, what about this one? Or you can scroll over to this one. And technologically, we are just as easily able to offer a solution which says, what are you looking for? My paddy's affected by leaf blight. Then you can ask them some questions to say, are the spots brown or the spots white? And then you could give them, is this what your paddy looks like? And then you could give some recommendation for what type of pesticide or fungicide, I guess, in this case, you would need. And so the motivating study for this work is an RCT that I did with Nilesh Fernando, who's a PhD student at Harvard. It was on a mobile phone-based advisory service in Gujarat. This was sort of pre the founding of our NGO. It was delivered by a different NGO, Development Support Center, and focused on cotton. And these are low-income, illiterate farmers in rural areas, and so it's all voice-based. They get a push call about 3 to 5 minutes long once a week with agricultural topics. They have a question and answer service where they can give the service a missed call. The service will call them back. They can record a question, and then within 24 hours, they'll get a voice message with the answer to their question. And then there are forums where they can listen to other people's discussions. And so the content is curated by an agronomist who examines the current questions, surveys randomly selected farmers, and tries to develop stuff that's relevant both locally and temporally. Back then it was kind of a hot commodity to be able to do this voice communication with people with very low levels of technological literacy. I think now that's pretty simple. We're not yet at the point, at least in India, where we have high quality voice recognition for the local languages, like at least where we're working, Uriya and Gujarati, but that will come in the next year or two. So I think the technology is not the problem in terms, it's really figuring out what type of information you want to provide, how to get consumers to trust that information, and how to get them to evaluate it. So in this RCT, we did a study with 1,200 farmers in Gujarat. It was a random selection of the sample, so we didn't pick tech-savvy farmers or people who are interested in getting advice. We just said, if you grow cotton, you're eligible for our study. Treatment control, we had both a voice-only service and a voice service plus once-a-year physical extension as 2 different treatment arms. Service seemed to be pretty popular. 63% of the treatment population called in to ask a question, and they heard about 54% of the push call content, which is about 120 minutes of content. And we, this was in the old days, this is like my last paper survey ever, but we did, individual household level visits to do paper surveys to try to get relatively low levels of attrition for the impact evaluation. And so, the results I would say were encouraging, if not just positive. So it really seemed to affect how people sourced information. So when we asked, what are your primary sources of information on the following topics? On many of the topics, they said the mobile phone is the primary source. So this is the difference between the treatment and the control group. These are all statistically significant, well, except for that one and that one. I think the very interesting thing for us was that we didn't find an effect on price information, and we didn't ever provide price information in this trial. So it sort of helps address some of the placebo. The person just says, yes, 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 I like this service, keep giving it to me for free. And the service also seems to change agricultural practices. So we took indices of behaviors to adjust for multiple outcomes. And about a 0.08 standard deviation effect on cotton pest management. And these were about 40% of the questions that came into the service were about cotton pests. That's something that changes very frequently from the farmer's perspective. The pests they encounter vary over time. And they also really don't trust the local agri-dealers, who typically will give them recommendations on how to kill the bugs. But we did sort of a separate audit study of that, and we find that the agri-dealers recommend too many pesticides and too high a quantity of pesticides. So the farmer succeeds in killing the bug, but it costs them more than it should have, and is actually often exposing them to pretty toxic chemicals that are not effective. So we found some effects on practices. We didn't find in this setting any measured effects on outcomes, so it seems like they're taking the advice. They're not becoming better agronomists. And we found sort of, I think reasonable evidence of effects on yield. The study was not very highly powered to detect yield, but we found a 10 percentage point increase in cotton around 0.1 and a 33% increase in cumin yield around 0.05. So, this is enough motivation for us to say, let's continue to refine, develop, and test services like this. And we have done that. And here's some very out of sample tests, which are done by Michael Kramer and his team in Africa, which relate to providing farmers some very specific interventions, which are about text messages on soil acidity. And basically, there's a problem in African agriculture, as I understand, that a lot of soil is too acidic, but some soil is not, and some soil is. So you wouldn't necessarily want to give a blanket recommendation that everybody apply lime, which is what reduces the acidity of the soil. So the government started out on their own and said, they just sent a text message to farmers saying, if the soil pH is below 5.5, apply lime. But of course, the farmers don't know what soil pH is. They don't know what their soil pH is. They might know what lime is, and so that had no impact. And then as you sort of refine the messages, soil tests near you suggest you should apply lime. You get an impact. The soil in your area is acidic. To avoid low yields, apply lime. You get an impact. Hello, Ben, your soil is acidic. Even higher impact. Scott, 1 Acre Fund recommends that you buy lime, 14%. So as you sort of refine the messages, you can sort of, and these are all separate samples, separate trials, and so you can start to build a pretty credible case that people want the information and that the information can change their behavior. And so those early trials maybe plus the work that I had done motivated a few of us to found this nonprofit called Precision Agriculture for Development. We're currently reaching about 500,000 farmers in 6 countries. And as I said, the mission is to design, evaluate, and scale customized agricultural advice. And the ultimate mission is to build a financially sustainable service which will reach 100 million people. And we have lots of ideas about what financially sustainable could mean. It could be advertising revenue. It could be making markets and taking commissions. It could be the Gates Foundation just says, this is really good for Africa. We're going to sign a 20-year contract or a 10-year contract to help support the service. We're a little bit agnostic on that. But I think there is a lot of money potentially to be made, or revenue at least, we're a nonprofit, so I should say, revenue to be earned by a platform or information service provider that is trusted. And so at the end of the talk, I'll talk a little bit more, but I think another thing that, wearing more of my academic hat, we're hoping to do is, we've got a system in Gujarat that is sending out messages to 100,000 farmers every week, and very soon, in about 6 months, that's going to be 1 million farmers every week. And there's sort of a larger sample than we ourselves could know what to do with. So we'd be very happy to engage with other people who are interested in these types of questions to design experiments to run on this platform. So as you see this talk, if there's anything that catches your mind, feel free to approach Michael or me, and we'd be super happy to discuss building more experiments.
So is this paper by Hafshamp and Minton in the neighboring state of Maharashtra?
Yeah.
Which also gave text message information very similar.
Mm-hmm.
So they found 0 effects.
Yeah.
Everything they cared to look at. Is that something about the context, or is it something about the design of the service?
Right. So that they were studying RML, Reuters Market Light, which was a sort of almost a CSR opportunity, but probably a new markets opportunity by Thomson Reuters. That was like version 1.0 of this type of product. So it was like 5 text messages each day to farmers, and it didn't meet commercial success. It didn't have very high retention. They've totally changed the model now, and they've got a much higher value app-based service that they're marketing to cash crop farmers with large acreage, and the fees are now $60 to $100 per crop per season, and they seem to be getting some traction with that model. I think one premise we have wholeheartedly embraced is that this is very hard to do. It's not just that you start sending out information and everybody's life is improved, right? And so if you look at Reuters Market, we actually taught a case study on RML in one of our classes. It's not clear that they were taking like a human-centered design approach to coming up with services that the farmers actually needed. They didn't really have any evaluation built into the design and delivery and scale of the service. It was really like let's get this service to 1 million people so that we can report up the headquarters chain that we have 1 million users. And so they paid a third-party marketing firm to sign up a bunch of customers for them, and then they found out half of those signups were fake, right? So it was just I think it is, I don't want to understate how hard this is also, right? So there are at least 100 services that have tried to, in a for-profit manner, develop agricultural information for farmers in low-income industries, and they typically just can't get to scale. It's very expensive to take payments from low-income people, especially when they're micropayments, and sort of the arrival of digital financial services will reduce that. But I would say, and we have done other trials that have not worked. We've done trials that have worked. So what we're trying to do is build up a body of evidence of what works when and where.
And you think it's information and not, there are no financial it's cheap enough stuff that the lime is cheap enough to apply. That's not where the constraint is.
I think there are for sure credit constraints in markets. There are access to market constraints. There are tons of constraints, and I don't want to claim that information is going to solve all of these problems. I mean, so in the lime constraint, Michael was working with 1 Acre Fund, which was also marketing lime and would provide credit to the farmers to buy lime if they so chose. So that solved that constraint. My personal motivation behind this is that the cost is so tiny to deliver this information that the benefit really only has to be very small to have a tremendous, like 100 to 1 benefit to cost ratio, or 1,000 to 1. So even if we don't solve, but I can talk to you about how I think this may actually also help solve credit constraints and market constraints, because like as we build up a profile of the farmer and get data on what type of messages they listen to and what type of questions they ask, and we're starting to process the satellite data to measure their yields, we might start to be able to give banks leads into which farmers might be more bankable, or work with fintech providers to provide financing. So I think there's a sort of a long-term vision that this may help just solve these market voids that exist in emerging markets. But for now, we're not doing any sort of financial intervention there. Okay. So I'd point to Farmers Business Network, which is a U.S. company that it also, I think, helped inspire my vision, at least my vision, to create this company. This is a Silicon Valley startup that was founded by an MBA student here who was like driving with his fiancée across country, and they stopped in Nebraska, and he helped his brother-in-law out with the harvest, like to earn goodwill with the family. And he was talking with his brother-in-law, like, what's life like? And he's like, it's pretty good to be a farmer. It's a lifestyle decision. We like it, but these damn seed companies keep marketing us different seeds, and we have no idea whether this seed is actually more effective than the last year's seed. Is it worth the extra, 3% premium? And I talk to my neighbors, and they tell me they had a good experience with this seed or a bad experience with this seed. And we try to gather information, but there's really no way to do that in any sort of systematic way. And so he had come from a data analytics background, and he said, well, wow, if we can start systematically collecting information on what type of inputs people use and what type of outputs people use, we can then give them unbiased advice about the expected yield of your seed type in your region. In the US, this is super easy because the tractors will record exactly how many seeds they put down on a meter by meter basis, and then they'll tell you at the end of the season exactly how much yield they get. So they started just marketing, and they sort of did a test focus with US farmers and said, if I just printed out a sheet of paper that said, this seed variety will give you this much yield, this seed variety will give you this much yield on your farm, how much would you pay for that piece of paper? And the farmers, I give you $5,000 for that. So it was way more than they expected. And so they launched the company, collected a bunch of data, did some analytics, started giving recommendations. And then they realized that input markets also in the United States are actually not that efficient. There's a ton of price discrimination in agricultural markets. There's a lot of mom and pop shops. And so they started, just as a sort of minimum viable product, they just called up some farmers and said, what if we would sell you generic chemicals at 30% discount of what you're paying from your local agri-dealer? And they got a ton of yeses. So people said, I trust you already because you're giving me this high quality information. I'm willing to take a chance with you on input provision. And so now they're heading to $1 billion IPO within 6 years of founding. So in the US, there's a ton of money to be created in these settings. I hypothesize that's true in emerging markets in some settings, but it's not quite as obvious. And then the other thing I think that excites me or terrifies me about this is I feel like we're in a unique time for the arrival of information service, right? So this is actually better than I feared, but if you search for, cure for the common cold, you immediately get a bunch of products that say shop for cure for cold, right? And of course we know that none of those products actually cure the cold. And so if we leave it all to the market, we may end up in a world where a lot of bad products get sold, and especially in weak state environments where it's very hard to go after companies that make misleading claims, markets could kind of break down. In Bing's defense, they actually say, there is no cure for the common cold as one of the first actual search results, but before you get there, you get to the ads offering products. Okay. So a bunch of other frictions in information markets, right? So the private costs of information collection may exceed the benefits, but there may be a lot of positive externalities of collecting and sharing that information. So we may have an under collection of information at the individual level. Then at the firm level, if you decide I'm going to collect information and try to share it and turn that into a business model, people who are your potential customers might just get the information from their peers who are actually subscribing to it. So there may be insufficient willingness to pay on that level. Advertising seems to be the solution for most software as a service or consumer-facing services that we see, but I think there's a real chance that they could reduce the credibility of the information that's provided, and at least from our perspective, changing farmer behavior is really difficult. So we're interested but cautious about using advertising. You may be in situations where services have to make individuals to take actions that are valuable to others but less valuable to themselves. providing information on your own outcomes would help train the algorithms to make better recommendations next year, but it's a pain to call in and answer, no, you machine, you have it wrong. I don't have 3 acres, I have 4 acres, and my yield was not 110, it was 130. And so are you going to really go through all that, even if your the marginal impact on the average recommendation might be positive, but on your specific, it doesn't really help you. So there are a bunch of frictions. So I just have a little bit to say about a few different frictions, and then I'd be very, Scott said we can leave time for discussion, and Ben said we can leave time for discussion at the end for ideas and suggestions. So one thing we noticed in the first study was that it did change how people collect and share information. So people who were randomized into the treatment group were less likely to visit peers who were in the control group. But the control farmers were more likely to go visit people who were in the treatment group, and we saw evidence of spillover of agricultural activities, right? So there's a prima facie case that A, there's information spillover, B, maybe our treatment estimates are downwardly biased because we're not properly accounting for that in the RCT. When we finished the survey, when we finished the study, so they got the service for 2 years, and we were winding it down, and we said, but let's understand how this might work in a market setting. So what we did is we sold the service to them, and we did this in 2 ways. We did either a Becker to group Marshak mechanism with them, and we sort of first did that with a candy bar to make sure they understood it, and then we said, okay, now we're going to do it with the service. If you'd like to have the service for 6 more months, how much is it worth to you? And we also, so that was like, I think, a quarter of the sample. And then 3/4 of the sample, we did just a take it or leave it offer. SEMA, the service, 300 rupees, do you want it or not? And so that allows us to compare the treatment and the control. That allows us also to compare the elicitation methods, because BDM obviously has a lot more information. But sort of the refreshers, like the point estimate, which would not be statistically significant, is about $200 more in profits per farmer per year from having the service, right? These are not that poor farmers. Their average revenue is probably 12 or 14. Profits are in the thousands. But the willingness to pay is much lower. So I don't have the average number here, but 80% would pay $1 for 6 months, and not just would, but did pay $1, because these were not hypotheticals. These were, if you want the service, give us 58 rupees or 60 rupees, and we sold the service. So on one level, this is in contrast to Michael's work on deworming, where once you go from 0 to any positive price, demand plummets. So that's a little bit encouraging that there may be a market appetite for this. But if you were a profit maximizing firm, it turns out you would end up pricing out very high on the high end, and that would maximize your total revenue, but you'd have many fewer users, and it would exclude the poor users, right? So that's not a great solution for us as a nonprofit organization.
Apropos of some of the conversations at dinner yesterday, could you somehow use profits from the higher end, the higher income people to subsidize the lower?
Yeah, so you could think of a freemium model or a means tested price sliding scale, absolutely. And technology makes that so much easier than in physical goods markets. The other good news is that we're in debates with referees about whether these lines overlap or not. But from my visual, like the BDM and take it or leave it perform pretty well as elicitation mechanisms. So that gives you some hope that you can use BDM and need smaller samples. Yeah.
Have you asked farmers to assess how much they benefited from the information? How accurately do they know?
Yeah, no, we've asked them do you think it's useful? But we haven't asked, does this improve your profits or anything? And I think,
that'd be interesting.
I think that's right. I think it's the other thing that's challenging about this sector is because the costs of the intervention are so low. Even if the benefits are pretty small, it's a no-brainer. But from the individual farmer's perspective, if you're only getting a 10% increase in yield and yields are super stochastic, it's much harder to know yourself whether this is beneficial for you or not, which you could put in sort of another friction of the information market.
So I was thinking, you want to model demand in a dynamic, stochastic sense. People who do sign up, they evaluate it, and then that affects their demand and the neighbor's demand.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's a lot of learning there. So Michael did some work in Kenya about soil chemistry tests, and this is just an example that the private market may underinvest in soil information. Basically, they cost about $10 each. But if you ask farmers, how much would you pay for this test, they'll certainly say less than $10. But if you ask them, how much would you pay for your neighbor's test, you get somewhere between $2 and $5 based on how you do the elicitation. And so basically, a test is socially valuable because it provides information for all the neighbors, and the neighbor's valuation is higher than the cost of the test. But it's not being provided as a market service yet. And so there's some hope that some sort of aggregator could help solve some of these market problems. I probably butchered that. Michael can jump in.
Possibility of contracting with communities instead of individual farmers.
Okay.
You mentioned that they would internalize some of
Right. Yeah. So I think the contracting costs of contracting with communities might be very high, but I think agricultural cooperatives or contract farming companies or others might actually very much be willing to pay for these services.
What about local governments?
Yeah. So example, in Odisha, state of Odisha is paying $3 million for us to launch this service to reach 1 million farmers. And they're just saying, actually, to reach 1 million farmers. And now they're saying, actually, 1 million is not enough. We want you to go to 5 million. So I think there actually is a fair amount of willingness to pay for these types of services out there, especially if you can build up an evidence base that they're effective. Oh, you want? Okay. So advertising, I think, is a source of revenue that I like NPR, but we shouldn't ignore. I think my concern is often that once you get financial incentives mixed with editorial content, you could degrade the quality of the recommendations, which we saw in Indian insurance market or in Indian agricultural market. We don't yet have a study on that. We just have one study on advertising, which is we partnered with AgroStar, which is aiming to be like the Amazon of agricultural inputs in India. You can basically call up and order a specific kind of seed. They'll send it through the Indian Post system, cash on delivery. So they get all of those costs sort of taken care of at a reasonable rate, and then the customer gets a high quality product at a price they trust. And so they were interested in working with us to use the information service to increase customer engagement because they thought customers who felt that they were getting unbiased advice might buy more. And so we did a sort of a RCT or A/B tests. They then sort of found other priorities as a startup and never gave us enough data to actually do much with the results. The punchline on increasing sales is it doesn't seem like we increased sales for AgroStar by giving some of their customers these voice messages. But the other thing that we noticed was when the message was sent out as coming from PAD, the nonprofit, the pickup rate from users was 10 percentage points higher than when the message was sent out as coming from AgroStar. And so there's maybe some differential trust or willingness to listen to content from a nonprofit versus a for-profit entity. So I think we're in the first stages of laying out our set of advertising RCTs. And I think there are a lot of interesting questions here that have partially, I think there are a few papers on this in the economics literature, but I actually also think it seems a bit understudied. Like, to what extent should we curate advertisements and take some credibility or put a stake in saying these are high quality advertisements or high quality products, or should we just let the free market run wild? Should we endorse the advertisements? And then the sort of the generic questions that are my marketing colleagues interesting questions. But with this, the system's pretty powerful because you're sending out 100,000 messages tomorrow, and it's very easy to send 10,000 people message A, 10,000 people message B, 10,000 people message C, and you immediately get some measure of engagement, which is how much of the message do they listen to? We're trying to train people to rate the message on a sort of 1 to 5 scale, so we get better feedback, but that has some attrition concerns. But so we're trying to build in settings where you get this rapid A/B rapid feedback that you can get in Silicon Valley firms to dramatically improve products. Other sort of, I think, market design type questions that we're worried about are, crowdsourcing. I think this type of service will be a lot more valuable the more information we can get from the ground. And so how can you motivate people to pay those individual costs, which might not be huge individual gains? So in Kenya, again, Michael is working with Safaricom and the government of Kenya to send out SMS messages to all Kenyan farmers. Basically, there's an old bug called fall armyworm, which has been very devastating to maize crops in South America and has finally arrived in Africa and India now. And so the Ministry of Agriculture is really worried, how do we get people to start to recognize and deal with this new pest that they don't know about? And people are taking sometimes bad decisions with how to deal with it. So This is a nice setting just for testing different types of persuasion techniques, altruistic, help your community fight fall armyworm, leadership, lead your community, or self-preservation, follow armyworm moves from farm to farm, protect yourself by inviting your community members to learn about it, reply with this SMS. We then did did a follow-up which said either ranking, like you're number 2 out of 20 or you're number 1 out of 20, move up your rankings by getting more of your neighbors to sign up, or become a super farmer by getting more messages, and then some more comparative statics. You keep moving up in the ranking or don't keep moving up in the ranking. So one thing that jumps right out at you here is just the power of reminders, because when these reminders are sent out, you get a lot more signups. And I think this is something we have in our mind but haven't yet tested that formally. In a lot of the value of PAD might be just reminders. Remember, it's time to apply your fertilizer next week. Be sure you have it on hand and you're ready to go as soon as it rains. They know they need to apply fertilizer, but the nudges and the reminders could be effective. And so we're interested in doing studies that distinguish the value of information versus reminders or nudges. It didn't matter, it turns out, as much. The differences between the different types of messages were more modest. But it was a super low-cost test to try to understand how to get more people to sign up to these services. So I mentioned the farmer's value of platform that can provide advice, but also goods and other services. Like if the value of trust, especially in emerging markets, is very high, you have seeds are often counterfeit, fertilizer is often adulterated, and so the local markets might not work very well. And it's the sort of typical network economics where the platform is more valuable with more farmers, not just because of market sizing and, let's say, spatial matching considerations, but also because of data analytics. You can start to give better recommendations the more people and the more information you have on the platform. So, like I said, we sending out up to 1 million messages a week. We've got rapid feedback on does the user listen to the call? Do they rate it? Do they respond to SMS or IVR inquiries? We're sort of piloting now just voice response. We're figuring out how to pilot voice responses, where farmers just have to answer questions, and the machine will use voice to text to try to help them through this. We can do phone surveys relatively cheaply because we have call centers in the local language. So if you want to do a 500-person randomly selected survey of 10 questions just to see if an idea might stick, you can get the result in a day or two. And then if you want to do that as an outcome, it can be built in. And so, an example, we had not an academic, but somebody who he had a PhD in animal husbandry and an MBA, and he was interested in studying a dairy information service. And so we were able to just plug him into our platform for less than $5,000 over 3 months. He connected to 1,000 farmers and ran this dairy service to see whether it would get traction, and he decided yes. So I think we're looking to expand that. So I think we're very interested in that. So I did promise to end early. So billions have been excluded from modern information services. This is really going to change a lot in the next 5 years. I think I guess everybody thinks that what they're working on is the most important thing, but I'm kind of surprised at how few of our PhD students seem to be working on tech and ICT, given how important I think it is going to be for development. And I think revenue models are really challenging here and interesting, therefore, and that trust, behavior change, matching, and platform design are probably going to determine the winners and the losers. And I would say that the obvious is not necessarily inevitable, right? So M-Pesa came out, and everybody's like, oh, wow, mobile money is going to be here. Everybody's going to have payments in their pocket. And 5 years after it had launched, only 3 of the 150 services that had been launched to provide digital financial services around the world in developing countries had reached 1 million users or more. And I think some of that was due to regulation, a lot of that was due to product design, some of that was due to potentially low value proposition, but sort of saying it's coming doesn't mean that it's going to come and be good, or it's going to come and meet the needs of the people who need it most. So I think there is a real role for us as academics to try to contribute in how these products can be shaped and launched. So that's all I have as my main talk. So.
First off, I'd like to thank Shawn for giving me a chance to discuss this absolutely fascinating project. I think it's a really distinct kind of market from the markets that we usually think about dealing with, and rather than try to address everything about behavioral interventions, I'm going to try to talk quite specifically about the design issues raised in these kinds of markets for information and how we might attempt to help people transact in information in a better way. So this paper seems to raise, or this set of papers, this literature seems to raise a very natural puzzle, which is that apparently farmers in developing countries lack productivity enhancing information and markets mostly don't seem to provide it. So if there have been 100 attempts to provide something and none of them have managed to become sort of sustainably profitable yet, that's a sign that there's some sort of puzzle or anomaly going on. And one quite reasonable hypothesis to come in to this with is to say, okay, the problem here is that information is fundamentally an experience good. It's very difficult for me to sell you information and tell you that information is high quality if you don't yet know what it is I'm going to say to you. Of course, one of the things that this raises is that it looks a lot like even after having experience with the good, people just aren't willing to pay that much for it. So we saw just now that the average willingness to pay for a 9-month subscription is about $2. The cost of provision of these information services is about $7. And there's this lovely quote from the paper. The return for a 2-year subscription can be estimated at more than $200. So if we take these claims at face value, what that suggests is that farmers are misestimating the value of this information to them by several orders of magnitude. But I'd just like to point out perhaps the start of this quotation. The study was not designed to have power to detect changes in profitability. And this is a study with 1,200 respondents. I think it seems like a very natural question to ask at this point is, farmers probably don't have 1,200 observations. They have substantially less. If the experimenters are having difficulty detecting improvements in yield or profitability with 1,200 observations, it seems quite reasonable to think that farmers basically have no idea whether this enhances their profitability, and if so, how much. And this kind of reminds me of this paper that some of us may have seen, The Unfavorable Economics of Measuring the Returns to Advertising. I think before referees got to this paper was titled The Near Impossibility of Measuring the Returns to Advertising. But it does make this quite reasonable point, which is that when you're trying to look at something where the outcome measures are highly volatile, like profits for advertisers, you require massive amounts of information in order to estimate that. So this paper is mostly dealing with 25 field experiments by tech companies trying to increase the returns, trying to estimate returns to advertising. But this, one suspects, generalizes to cases like advice for farmers. In particular, it seems like there are so many different ways that you can have slips between cup and lip. There can be problems with farmers understanding the advice. There can be problems of compliance even after they understand the advice. There can be all kinds of correlated shocks to crops that may happen to many people at once that may affect your ability to measure the worth of advice. And so this suggests quite strongly that we aren't just having an experience good where you individually need to have experience. We face a real problem of adverse selection in these markets. Shawn has some other work suggesting that there is an awful lot of bad advice out there. And it seems like one of the problems is that, in some sense, good advice is very expensive to do. But bad advice can be freely produced and is ex ante extremely difficult to distinguish from good advice. And so we can all write the following toy model. The outcome is not contractable. There's a zero cost of producing bad advice. There is some market price for advice, and under natural assumptions, the equilibrium price for advice is zero. And this raises additional difficulties then for the difficulty of sort of advertising funded models, which, I thought quite naturally one would expect us to be able to somewhat be able to get around the problem of advice by saying this is free, but it turns out that when you say it's free and it's funded by advertising, that creates a whole set of other problems that Shawn has just told us about. So I guess maybe a useful dichotomy to think about this work is there are elements of this work that relate to product design, and there are elements that relate to what we might more standardly call market design, right? The product design questions essentially are, how can we get farmers to adopt our good advice? What can we do? How can we present the product? How can we package the product? How can we remind people about the product in such a way as to get them to use it? And then there's a set of questions that relate more to the design of rules and institutions, right? To say, on the one side, there are people who might be able to provide advice. Some of them provide good advice. And on the other side are people who may benefit from good advice. How can we choose a different set of rules or institutions that ensures that this advice is transacted? In particular, that the providers of this good advice can sell at a profit. And I think this maybe relates a little bit to the question of what the mission of PAD is or should be, right? I think there's a legitimate question for whether PAD should see itself as a producer of good advice and also a provider of good advice, or as a platform that matches up people who can generate good advice with people who can use that good advice. And I don't know what the economies of scale in each of these are, but I would guess that in a sort of large and revenue sustainable model, that perhaps there's a room for PAD to be the seller or the mediator for other people's advice. And if that's so, then we reach interesting questions in market design. Not least, by the way, this dichotomy is exceedingly fuzzy. We encounter product design questions in market design all the time. For instance, in combinatorial spectrum auctions, there are real questions about which kinds of usage rights should be bundled together in order to be sold to people. And it turns out that somewhat the ability to design a good market partly involves defining where the edges of the product are. So which kinds of services should go with each other. And so one then wonders if there are natural solutions from market design that come towards being able to mediate good advice and bad advice. In particular, there is extensive work on reputation systems in crowdsourcing platforms. Is it possible that we might be able to sort good advice from bad advice by being able to aggregate, say, cheap talk reports about what that advice is? What about having contingent systems for payments and incentives? Now, of course, it's been historically very difficult to extract small payments from farmers, and it may be indeed quite hard to accurately measure their crop yields. But you could imagine systems where, rather than conditioning on their final profits, one found accurate or audited reports of crop yields and perhaps said, you know, I'm only going to charge you for this advice in the states of the world where it's good advice. And a related thought is that perhaps one role for an organization like PAD is to centralize verification costs. That it sounds somewhat like the cost of running an experiment to check whether advice is good or bad is itself a public good. And that one role for a centralized mediator might be exactly to run experiments to determine which advice is good or bad and to develop a reputation for being able to sort good advice from bad advice. I think, having prepared these slides in advance, I think there are maybe just two things I'd add to that before abiding by my promise to Ben to hit 10 minutes and leave time for some sort of real conversation. One is that I've been very much thinking about this paper from the point of view of general advice, where there's something that is generally a good idea. You should keep your soil pH levels at the following level, so use a lot of lime. But when we're dealing with generalized advice, advice is very plausibly a public good. It's very hard to exclude people from it, because if one person in a neighborhood buys a piece of advice, he can very plausibly share that with his neighbors. But customized advice is perhaps more like a club good, in the sense that it's non-rival, but it is excludable, because on the margin you can refuse to provide someone customized advice for their particular soil quality, location, and crop yield. And that perhaps opens up different avenues to charge for it and different kinds of revenue streams. A related idea is on revenue streams is that there is maybe a connection between the problem of finding advertiser-funded models and the aligned delegation literature. In particular, if we think of these as very simple problems, like advertisers want you to buy more fertilizer, your recommendation is how much fertilizer to buy, then it seems like there's an obvious problem of of not being able to give good advice or have advice that the end user might think is biased. But insofar as the problem has multiple dimensions, it might be possible for advertisers to make revenue of one dimension of the problem and to give advice on the orthogonal dimensions that, by virtue of being orthogonal, might therefore be trustworthy. So I wonder if this is maybe an application where the multidimensionality of the problem could be used to help fund the problem while keeping the advice credible. So with that said, I think it may be much more sensible for Shawn to have some time to talk about this and for everybody else to have time to give comments and feedback.
Yes, Shawn, I'll let you manage.
Yeah, no, I think everything you said sounds extremely reasonable and helpful. So thank you for that. I think I would have prepared a much better presentation if I had seen your comments before. The sequencing problem divided. So, or you had your hand up first.
There you go. So, both to Shengwu and to you and to you and to you, I have a question. When it comes to market design, I wonder what kind of assumptions you make about how farmers, in this case, make decisions, and especially new kind of decisions. What are the assumptions? Deciding a market here is really dependent on those assumptions. Do you think that farmers actually change their way of doing things because of diffusions of ideas? Or is it because, for example, that they're competing with other farmers? What are the basic assumptions here? And I think that's really important to know. Is it through rumors, reputation? Is it through what shit talks or whatever it's called here in economics? That is, I think, as important as trying to figure out reservation or how much they're ready to pay. I don't have any answers on this, but I think it's worthwhile thinking about this when you design a market in a particular culture or environment. Any views? That would be great. What do you think is going on in this particular market?
I mean, I'll say what some things I know that I don't know. So one thing we did with this willingness to, and this isn't quite answering your question, but response to discuss it. We did on the willingness to pay study. We actually compared the willingness to pay of people who were in the treatment group with people in the control group, and there we didn't find a differential willingness to pay, which surprised me. I thought that there would be some experience component or willing to. And there's a huge literature on social learning, the importance of social learning in agriculture. I think there's much less knowledge about when there's any sort of market related with those decisions, right? It's really just you see other people doing things, or people give you advice and you decide to do that. But I've seen very little about paying for advice or thinking about the market. So I don't know if you have any thoughts, Mike.
I mean, I guess I would think that to some extent they're trying to maximize profits, like other firms. I guess this is maybe not a comment on directly response to that question, but the other thing I would add to everything that Shawn said is, I'm very interested in just governments. I mean, I feel like there are a lot of problems in these markets, and I think governments are a natural provider of this information, and a lot of what PAD does is work with governments to help governments set up systems or improve systems to provide advice. And to that extent, we're sort of a consulting, or a nonprofit consulting organization that works with governments to do it.
As an aside, I'm really surprised by the results about the BDM because my experience in the lab has been that typically lab BDMs are incredibly noisy. To have a graph like that shows sort of take or leave it offers basically lining up with BDM reports is. I mean, I'm surprised referees give you trouble. I wouldn't expect to get results that clean if I was running this in a lab. And maybe we should be adopting whatever protocol you were using to.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess we did spend 4 years doing BDM in other contexts before we showed up and did it here. So in that particular setting in Gujarat, so we had. But of course, we should probably also. We can't show you the scatter plot of the take it or leave it off the individual level, right? This shows the distribution of willingness to pay is the same. Maybe there's. But yeah, it is. I was pleasantly surprised by that for sure.
I was wondering, you're giving advice to the farmers, but you could also at the same time be collecting information from the farmers. And couldn't you, I'm not sure why with 1,200 farmers it was not possible to figure out what the effects were of the advice, whether they were positive or not. But I can imagine a situation in which you have a much larger sample, where you can actually see how the treatment farmers do better than the control farmers, and you could then give them the additional information that this advice has caused farmers to increase their profits or.
I think that's absolutely right. I think two compelling use cases are contract farming organizations where they're already measuring the yields with high level precision, so the costs of doing the RCT are pretty small. Or, we're experimenting with drones and satellites, finding ways to measure pretty well at very low cost the outcomes. So very interested in that.
Maybe riffing off that, one way to get some of the lower income farmers in is maybe to turn sort of the part of the platform into information provision in exchange for value. Right? You could imagine that basically it's costly for anybody to listen to to the end of the sequence of things to fill out a survey, but the less well-off farmers would be willing to do that in exchange for access.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we've sort of talked about Netflix for agriculture, where you provide information on which movies you like, because that'll help it give you better recommendations. And some of this pest stuff fits that very well. You call in to say you have a pest. Well, that's very valuable information for the agriculture authorities in understanding, where the pest is a problem.
It would seem like, so you were talking about the sort of role of government, and there are clearly private benefits to providing this information, but from a consulting perspective as well, like the public benefits are obviously very high as well. Like if we think that pesticide is overused already, like the health effects of that and the effects of pollination and other things. So it would be interesting to you in the context you're working in, is able to look at health effects?
We're working with, or we put a proposal into the Nature Conservancy to work on air crop burning, which would reduce that. You can measure whether the plot's burning by satellite. We're doing work in Rwanda, I guess, on tree planting, which is also measured by so I think there's definitely that aspect. Environment is part of our mission statement. And then there's, as you mentioned, government and public goods. I think another thing that we observe is around the world, governments will be focused on solutions for their farmers or their setting, but not thinking about, okay, I learned something useful in Kenya, how can I share that with Indonesia and improve their systems? So I think we see ourselves as also providing this global public good of sharing knowledge across settings.
So sort of related on that in terms of the cross-setting situation, I mean, one area that I've been interested in is on the insurance side of things. It would seem that in this context with improvements in measurements and everything else, that there would be not only sort of an opportunity for, given the reputation that's being built as well, for providing insurance, but also diversification across a very broad sort of set of markets. As you have thoughts to that?
We've thought about it a little bit in India. I think it turns out insurance companies everybody thinks about insurance as just a state contingent contract, but they actually spend a ton of time in risk reduction because they don't want to write checks. So we've had conversations with insurers about whether we could provide information that would de-risk some of the risk. So I've done a lot of work on index-based insurance in India and kind of walked away pretty worried, primarily with the concern of basis risk. And I think that exactly as you say, much better tech is going to dramatically reduce that basis risk. And so now I think it's absolutely a promising use case.
I'm still thinking a little bit about this problem of developing trust. How do you distinguish yourself as a good provider of advice? And it seems like one promising route is to just assert it. You've got a zillion people and you can do the statistics and please trust us that we're actually helping people. But of course, if people don't trust you, that might not be a very valuable assertion. So I wonder if there's some way to facilitate local information exchange about the quality of the advice you're giving. That if you get people together, then they can sort of try to aggregate how much good is happening from this program. And taking Shengwu's model very seriously, even the act of doing that might be in some sense a credible signal about at least your confidence in the information.
I think that's a good idea. I mean, in general, we try to avoid stuff that involves a ground game because it's too expensive. But the technology would allow like a chat board via audio where you can hear, record your experience and we'll play you the experience of 10 farmers in your neighborhood. And then you can listen to what, Scott says and what Philip says, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's a good idea that's not yet implemented.
Related to that, talking to farmers, I get the sense that part of this credibility trust issue is that they think, well, you're saying that based on maybe some experiments in some lab somewhere else, but in my village, my farm, my soil, so there's a lot of local variation. So to what extent are you also validating the value of the information? I don't know how much micro variation there is in terms of the value of the information. How are you, before you give the information, to what extent are you validating the value of that information to any particular target?
I think it differs in different contexts. I think in India we're kind of hamstrung by government regulations, which have very specific rules about what type of advice you can give. So you have to run everything through the state agricultural board, and I think that I would love to have 100 RCTs on 100 soil types and 100 irrigation types, and be able to say, we're really sure we're hitting it on this. There's a big standard error band around this piece of advice and sort of tailor advice. I think that's where we want to go. Right now, getting the yield data back is pretty challenging. So I would say it's a work in progress. I think if anything, there's a unsatisfactory test, which is the market test, that people are asking questions, people are consuming the information. So at least from their perspective, they see value in it. But I think it's TBD.
But to what extent will you be evaluating?
Always. I mean, we're running. We always have RCTs and A/B tests going on. That's a core part of what we're doing.
But yeah, I mean, the long-run vision, maybe a pipe dream, but the long-run vision would definitely be to have things be very personalized, not just by local geography. I mean, geography and agriculture, soil type, etc. is obviously vital, but also you could imagine, what's your risk tolerance as an individual? Do you have a spouse who's working in the city, bringing a regular income? You might be much more willing to plant risky crops than otherwise.
So I'm thinking also going through organizations in an institutional setting. For example, if you go to DRC, you wouldn't just go to a farmer and say, let me give you some advice. You might go through the Pentecostals. Once you reach Pentecostals, they evaluated your advice. It's going to spread like that. And so I think one needs to think about these different strategies.
Almost everywhere we're working with some partner organization, whether it's One Acre Fund in Kenya or the Ministry of Agriculture in India or another nonprofit.
And you know something about this.
Yeah, we do something.
So as you were talking about this, and as you were talking about this customized advice, I was thinking about samples. I mean, in Kenyan coffee auctions, there are like basically every harvest season there are tens of thousands of individual samples deposited in Nairobi for the coffee auction that the buyers in the coffee auction taste and smell, but the farmers get no information on what their sample looks like. They get a price. They can get a price by logging onto the website. But it just seems like a really nice setting for not just giving productivity enhancing kind of information, but also solving sort of incentive problems. The productivity enhancing information would be you send a sort of you send a sample report. BAD does a little takes a sample, does a you can tell what the quality of the coffee is by how it smells and so on. But the efficiency, the incentive issues are, you could actually send them what the price their coffee sold at, which farmers often don't check the website, and you could even tell them how much of their coffee reached the market, and that would be sort of like an exchange. It make it, I think, valuable on a few fronts, and it's And it seems like
I mean, I think we haven't even talked about price information here, right? But I think that's potentially another super interesting thing that relates to crowdsourcing, because often the price is posted by the government or not the actual price that the farmer realizes. And so you might be very interested in knowing what price did your neighbor actually receive.
So why didn't your intervention provide price information?
We didn't have, at the time we did the RCT, we didn't have the logistics to collect high quality price information. Since then, we've done some pilots where we collect now we form WhatsApp groups because the people who work in the markets are willing to give us the price information via WhatsApp. And so we've done some A/B tests with farmers. They value it a lot. We haven't yet seen data that is changing sales patterns, but it's definitely something to ask about.